He's one of the suspected gunmen in the Kenyan shopping centre siege, a Somali refugee who moved to Norway as a child. Hassan Abdi Duhali is seen as being part of Generation 1.5, people who are born outside Norway but having arrived young and finding themselves falling between two cultures. Well, we're going to be speaking to guests in Oslo and in Nairobi. You can see them getting ready just there. And then a little bit later on, we'll hear from US voters about how the government shutdown has changed politics there. We're here live for the next hour. And there are numerous ways to get in touch. You can get in touch via phone in the old-fashioned way, by Twitter, Google+, or you can tweet us using the hashtag WHYS.
I experience.
This is chaos.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Well, thanks for being with us here on World Have Your Say. If you've got any comments or questions, send them right into us and they'll come to me here on my tablet and we'll bring as many of them to you throughout the next hour. Now, let me introduce you to the guests we are joined by. We're joined by Hawa, who is a Somali student in Oslo. Also, Andre Kvakstad, who is Deputy Mayor of Ski, which is a town just south of Oslo. And also George Musamali, who's in Nairobi, a security expert and former commando with the General Service Unit, which is a paramilitary wing of the Kenyan police. I welcome all of you to World Have Your Say. Hawa, I'll start with you first of all. You're a Norwegian Somali woman, you're a student. How do you respond to these thoughts, it's still suspected at this stage, that one of the gunmen at the Kenyan shopping centre siege was in fact from your community in Norway?
Yeah, well, I'm surprised by the news and it's sad to hear it. It's horrific. And I'm just as surprised as any other Norwegian and sad to hear that it's a Norwegian Somali who might be involved in this. We
do hear that people are saying that around 20 or 30 Somali Norwegians head back to Somalia each year, are signing up to Islamist groups like Al-Shabaab. Amongst your friends, your family, people you talk to, is that something that they recognise within the community, or is it totally alien?
It's totally alien. I don't know about Somalis who've been recruited or are involved in communities where they nourish such negative thinking. But it's sad to know that it might be something going on in our community. And I'm really just shocked about it and never heard about anyone being involved in Al-Shabaab from here in Oslo. Never.
Hawa, let me introduce you to Andre. Welcome to the programme, Andre. What's your take on this?
Well, one just have to admit that terrorists can be from all countries, large and small, and that we have to keep our eyes open. And maybe I will be able to say that, especially when we hear about this Generation 1.5, where one in fact are going back to the countries where one's parents has fled from in order in fact to become a part of what a lot of people in fact are fleeing from. And I think when people are going back, making those kind of contacts, I think some alarm clocks ought to start ringing very heavily.
Well, Andre, it's interesting you talk about this Generation 1.5. Hawa, when you moved to Norway, did you feel there was enough support, whether it's locally in the community or more formally through the government, to help integrate you into life in Norway?
Well, I came to Norway as a 5-year-old girl, so I've been here my entire life almost. And I've never felt excluded from my society. I've been included. The only struggle that I met in Norway was learning Norwegian as a 5-year-old person. So I don't know if I can fall into that same genre as the one who might have been involved in this horrific event in Nairobi. But I don't relate to those issues of not being well integrated into society. It's always been going out
Andre, hang on a moment.
for me
Let's
and
Hawa
people
just
close
finish
to me.
her point and then we'll bring you back in.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hawa. Andre, you were trying to come in. Do go ahead.
Yeah, we have to remember that it is a small minority here who is being radicalized and making these problems also for the majority of Somalians. So one has to bear that in mind, that we're not talking about Somalians in general, But when that
No,
is
definitely not.
stated, we also have seen that it has sometimes been a bit more difficult to integrate Somalians. But I think it's important for all try to let people be integrated, but also to make them interested in being integrated. And therefore, it's very nice to hear also when it's our success stories that one can talk about.
It has been difficult for Somalis to integrate in the Norwegian community, but that of course has something to do with Somali minorities being quite new in this society. Most Somalis came here after the early 19s when the war started, and we haven't been here as much as other minorities like Pakistani Norwegians. So of course, and the culture that we come from is completely different from the one back home, and of course it's going to be difficult and hard to learn the language, get a job, and be a full member of the society. But at the same time, as you say, Andre, it is happening, and people are integrating and feeling as much a part of the society as everyone else.
Andre, what more do you think should be done to help that integration that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's important that we see people having success in their education who are doing positive thing at work, because I think it's important to see that one are contributing. Then it's also much easier to say, well, welcome and be part of our society. I think we are moving in the right way in general, but what is maybe the most frustrating thing to see is that a lot of those being radicalized are people who start off being successfully integrated often, by being successful, and then something happens. And I think we maybe need some help from the Somalian community to make us understand how can this happen? What are the triggering in those young persons who make them radicalize?
How would you want to speak to Andre?
Yeah, I would like to comment on is that of course, it's important for Somalis to tell the rest of the society what's going on in their communities here in Oslo and around in Norway. But at the same time, I think it's a problem that involves the whole society in general. Like the Norwegians need to be in dialogue with young Somalis, know what their communities are doing, and involve themselves more, and make sure that young Somalis are included in the society that they live in order to prevent them from going into these traps where they be recruited in groups such as Al-Shabaab.
One of the things I would like to state is that maybe one of the things is the big cause to fight for, and where can I feel at home? And then maybe it's important that one sees that the extremism who wants to make other person's life more difficult is not the right thing to fight for, but in fact it is a good thing to fight for human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and be able to have that also as a positive thing beside of what will only be a strong thing related to some extreme religious thoughts, which is not mainstream at all.
Yeah, you're making a very good point. And in my Somali community, like when we talk about Al-Shabaab, we always, in this sort of context, we say that they brainwash people.
Yeah.
Like that's what they do. They brainwash people to believe in whatever sick ideology that they're activating upon. And of course, young people will fall into that and being rewarded with something else. I don't know whether it's jihad or they use Jannah or whatever to make sure that what they're doing is the right thing, making young people believe that. And that is a big problem, because how do you stop people from being brainwashed in communities you don't know are doing such activities?
Well, Hawa and Andre, I want to introduce you to George Musamali, who is in Nairobi, a security expert and former commander with the General Service, which is General Service Unit, which is paramilitary wing of the Kenyan Police. George, listening to this, what comment do you want to make of this news that we're hearing out of Norway?
What is happening is that it has not come as a surprise to us. Because for quite some time here in Kenya, we've been observing that young men who had left Somalia as migrants to the West are coming back and actually joining Al-Shabaab. And the Norwegian is just one of them, because we've had people also come from Australia. We've had people coming from America. And in fact, 2 Americans have been involved in suicide bombing inside Somalia. So this is not a big surprise to us. But the question is now, how big is Al-Shabaab becoming in the wake of this? And we believe we are seeing that maybe these young men, when they go out to the West, they suffer what we call cultural shock. And they're not able to integrate into the societies that they are put in. And at some point, they become disillusioned. And that is why now Al-Shabaab is finding it easy to recruit from these young men. So it's supposed to bring a very much concern to the world, because very soon we are having a multinational terror group in our hands.
Well, George, Andre and Howard, do stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, but after that we'll look at some of the criticism which is being put very firmly at the West door, as we heard there from George, saying that actually the West is exporting terrorism to Africa and really needs to do more about that. Stay with us and we'll carry on talking in the next few minutes.
No,
Talking about it.
let me say something. No,
Talking about it.
let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Well, of course, you can upload a video if you've got a question or comment for us. worldhaveyoursay.com is the place to do it. Let's get this now from Ado, who is in Nairobi.
Kenyan Somali who lives in Nairobi. I think this issue of saying that there's a Somali Norwegian who has been linked to Westgate attack, I think this is a plot maybe to blame Somalis who are living in Kenya. But at least if he has been identified as a Norwegian Somali, then I think for that we as Kenyans, we as Somalis who are living in Kenya, we are off the blame.
Well, let's bring in now my colleague from BBC Somali, Mohammed. Welcome to World Have Your Say. Good to have you back on the programme. Your reaction to that comment there from Nairobi?
Well, as far as the Somalis are concerned, who are living everywhere, including Nairobi, are flabbergasted the developments about the Somali issue happening everywhere, and the Somali involvement in every criminal enterprise which is done in the name of jihadists. What we know is the people who have been raised in the West and the conditions, who have been, raised, that is social scientists to determine about it. But what is happening in Somalia and the fight against Al-Shabaab seems to be international one. They themselves said quite categorically clear that they are part and parcel of Al-Qaeda. And it seems now the Somalis everywhere are shocked about the news of their youngsters getting involved in this scenario.
So what is it that the West needs to do? Do Somalis feel the West needs to do to help integrate them, to prevent Somalis feeling that the only option is to turn to organisations like Al-Shabaab?
In the Norwegian case, when we have tried to speak to the communities in there, they were quite clear that they are not happy. Their name is getting associated with international terrorism. It's not the first case if it's confirmed. The Norwegian government is not confirming at this particular time. Investigation is going on, the involvement of this said young man in the case of Westgate. But what has happened is 2 other cases had happened previously, and they were upset about their association with it. And if this is confirmed, it will become another shock for Norwegian Somali community. And they were quite categorically clear, the politicians, the community leaders, the mosque leaders, and the normal people who have been speaking to us. Their position was very clear. They have got nothing to do with Al-Shabaab. They were trying to live like a normal citizens, like anywhere else in the world. But unfortunate things are happening that way.
George, what is it that the Kenyan authorities want from Western countries to help them tackle this kind of threat?
I think we need more support in terms of empowerment of our security officers, because you find that these Somalis that are coming from the West are a little bit complicated. They are not like the normal Somalis that we've been having around. And as you can see, the radicalization of Somalis is not happening in Kenya at the rate that we are seeing it happening in the West. So we expect the Western intelligence to be monitoring these people and be giving Kenya intelligence information on their movement. Because as you see, we have a problem in Kenya where we do not have enough boots on the ground. And our border with Somalia is so porous, such that monitoring these young men as they come in and get into Somalia is proving to be a challenge to the Kenya police. In fact, quite recently, the British government donated some vehicles to the Kenya Police Border Patrol unit. This is the kind of support that we're actually asking for from the West. I think it will go a long way in assisting us, ensuring that we do not have these elements that are coming to join Al-Shabaab crossing in and out of Kenya at will.
Hawa, I can see you nodding.
I'm agreeing with the comment that you just made, that the children the young boys going back to East Africa, Kenya, Somalia are troubled ones, and that I agree with that, because I've heard and seen stories of young people not being fully part of the Norwegian society, being sent back or freely going back to Somalia. Because they don't have the job, the education here in Norway. And that is something for the Norwegian society to look at and see why is it that some young minority boys are not fully active in their Norwegian society, and what can they do to provide them be more included in their society. Because there's something conflicting between their culture, their way of being, and the society that they live in that is not fully perfect, can you say?
Mohammed, I can see that you want to respond briefly, if you would.
Well, the youngsters who have been raised in the West completely have a different mindset of their counterparts in Somalia. They seem to have got what you call problems with the societies they are going away. And when they go to Somalia, they find a very harsh conditions. But if the person is determined to kill himself, it takes more than the Somali community or Kenyan community or anybody else, for that matter, to deal with it.
Mohammed, thank you so much. Do forgive me for jumping in. Thank you also to Hawa and to George. But we're going to cross over now to my colleague Nuala McGovern from World Have Your Say. She's up about 5 floors above me with... Who are you with, Nuala? BBC Swahili or Somali?
Exactly. Well, Somali is just to my right. We've been speaking with Mohammed. So let's move over to BBC Swahili and to Peter Musembi, who is one of the producers here. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Nuala.
Now, you've been hearing a lot about this story this morning. What have your listeners and viewers been telling you?
From the region that we broadcast to, that's East and Central Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa, it's no surprise at all that somebody, a Somali or Norwegian of Somali origin, was involved. Why? Because this has happened before. Al-Shabaab is not just about Somalis only. In the past, there have been attacks whereby young Somalis have been radicalized from the West, who left home as refugees, and now they are coming back home to join the Al-Shabaab, simply because they've been radicalized. It's happening. So people are not surprised at all. It's happened before.
And particularly in Kenya, what are they telling you?
And actually, that's the country that bears the brunt of Al-Shabaab activities, because they are next door, and most of them, before they get this side of the world as refugees, they've got to go through Kenya. We've got the biggest refugee camp in Kenya, in northern Kenya, and of course these are Somalis. People are indeed concerned that there are people in the West, Somalis, who are able to go back home to join Al-Shabaab. They are worried because they are aware that Al-Shabaab are being weakened in Somalia and in the region, but still they are able to be joined by other people, more complicated actually, and able to do worse going home to join them. So indeed there are concerns.
Are they worried about their image abroad?
We would say that people do know that Somalis left Somalia to come to the West, not because they are Somalis, but because they are refugees, and it's to do with not having a government for 2 decades, and of course there has been a war going on then. People do sympathize with Somalis, and they know that these people are not doing what they are doing because they are Somalis. They do know that people are being radicalized in the West, and there are other militant groups in different parts of the world, and this is just a copycat thing, so that Al-Shabaab is not isolated. They are also involved in the system.
Thanks very much, Peter. Talking to us there about a region really that's connected to the next story that I want to tell you about. I went to Malta earlier this week, and the reason I went there is because a boat capsized in the Mediterranean, close to this small island in the south of the Mediterranean. And I went to the Open Centre in Halfor. And why did I go there? Because migrants that were brought from boats that left North Africa, in particular Libya, came to that place. They came ashore in Valletta, Malta. And I met a number of people there. There were Somalis and Eritreans, but there were also Syrians and Palestinians. I want you to hear and see some of the people that we met. Malham, for example, a young 20-year-old Palestinian. 400 people.
Yes, 300 big and 100 children. And the first came the police Libyan and tried to make us turn back to Libya. But the captain said no, and we will keep going.
And what were you thinking at that point?
Oh, everyone is scared. After that, 6 hours follow us, the police Libyan, and tried to make us to turn back. But captain tried again and again and again to keep going.
And did you want to turn back, or did you want to keep going?
No, he turned back once, but the guys with us,
on the boat?
Yeah, tell him no.
Keep going.
Yes, keep going. After that, began to shoot us, shoot the boat.
Who did?
The police Libyan. Shoot the boat and shoot the 3 people.
What were they trying to do by shooting?
Make us to come back.
To turn back?
Yeah.
Where is that man from?
That's from Syria, so if you want to cut the interview for now.
He is down on his knees. He is just distraught with grief. Some of the other people are going to comfort him. And he's speaking on the phone, I guess, to somebody who perhaps has news of his relatives.
We are trying to provide mobile phones so they can speak to their relatives. I don't think that's good news for me. And this is what we have been witnessing now for 2 days.
He's an older man, I would say. He's a man that's perhaps in his 50s, and he's been supported by a lot of the younger men that have come. The young men that came really just a few days ago, as I've heard, that are Syrian and Palestinian, and they're trying to comfort him.
They have confirmed that his son is dead.
Oh my goodness. The poor man has collapsed, and some of the younger men are now carrying him away.
An incredibly difficult listen. If you want to listen to more of Nula's reports from Malta, you can search for SoundCloud and BBC World Service. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be talking about the US debt deal and how the 16-day government shutdown has affected US politics. So many people disillusioned. We will speak to more US voters in the next few minutes. Stay tuned.
Let me say something.
Hello, I'm Chloe Tilley. Well, the US debt deal has been done, but questions are still being asked about how America allowed itself to so close to what analysts described as global economic calamity. For the next 20 minutes, we'll discuss how the shutdown has affected US politics. Welcome back to World Have Your Say.
Talking about it.
Top priority.
I experience. It's just what?
This is chaos of you.
People are going to want to know.
Let me say something.
Well, if you're in the US, you can tweet us using the hashtag WHYS. What is your attitude towards your politicians after the shenanigans of the last 16 days? Let me introduce you to guests who are joining us now. Ed Morrissey is senior editor and correspondent for hotair.com in Minnesota. Brian Walsh is Republican strategist in Washington, D.C. But first, let's speak to Elizabeth Plank, who's editor at Policy Mike in New York. Elizabeth, welcome to the programme. Yesterday, President Obama said the American people are completely fed up with Washington. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think it's a fair assessment for sure. I think a lot of people have been disillusioned for a long time. I think that there are people who we don't usually talk about, which is the younger generation, millennials, who have been fed up for years now, and this has been kind of a turning point, a breaking point. They are not only fed up, they are frustrated. Millennials make up 95 million people in America. They are the next generation of voters. They will make up 25% of the people voting in the next election. And these people are not for small government. These people do not stand for, the repeal of Obamacare. A lot of them actually want it to be expanded. So this whole crisis basically has alienated a lot of people in America, especially young people.
Interesting you say alienated people in America, but Ed, what do you think about America's standing across the world? Isn't this hugely embarrassing?
Well, yes, I agree. It is embarrassing. I think that when you can't have a legislature that comes together and hammers out some sort of way to make sure that we're not at least at risk in damaging the world's strongest currency, at least from our point of view, and certainly the world's strongest investor currency, I think it really does have impact on global confidence in the American dollar, global confidence in the American market. And I think it's the same at home, too, for that matter. But yes, I think that these types of standoffs are largely non-productive and very potentially destructive.
Brian, we were discussing this on World Service Radio yesterday, and so many people were saying, quite frankly, the politicians are behaving like children. We all have to work with people that we find difficult or irritating, but the reality is we work with them and we get our jobs done. And that really wasn't happening for a long time in US politics. As a Republican, do you think that your party has made some massive mistakes over the past few days?
I've been a very vocal critic of the tactics that have been used by some Tea Party politicians. But look, I think both parties bear responsibility for what's happening right now with the U.S. economy. I mean, what's embarrassing, I find also, is the fact that we have a $17 trillion debt. The debt has increased 60% since President Obama took office. And so what's unfortunate here, I think, is there was a missed opportunity for both parties. But yes, as a Republican, I think the tactics were very wrong-headed.
Ed, you're nodding.
Yes, and here's the problem, and this is what neither party really wants to come to grips with, is that we are borrowing 40% of our annual spending at the federal level every single year. 40%. It's unsustainable. And so either we need to find ways to raise more revenue, or we need to start making some decisions, some painful decisions about what we're going to spend money on. And that is what both parties, I mean, that's both parties, that's the entire political establishment, and that's not just Washington, by the way. If you take polls, people say, oh, the deficit is a big, huge problem. We spend too much money. There's too much federal government control. But then when you start asking people, well, what do you want to cut? And nobody wants to cut anything. This is the reason why you have the politicians in the position that you have in Washington, D.C.
It's interesting you talk about polls, because we'll bring you some of those in the next few minutes. But Elizabeth, I could see you reacting as well.
Well, I think it's interesting that we focus on the differences between the parties when, there are members in the Senate especially who have really shown during this crisis, and it was female senators who actually we don't hear that much about during the year. We tend to hear about grand speeches and grand, gestures from the men, but we don't usually hear about the women. And I think what happened was really interesting. We really got, insight into the friendships and the nonpartisanship of women in the Senate coming together, forming a committee, and leading us out of this crisis. So I think we can focus on our differences all we want, but at the end of the day, everyone is working for the American people. And I think it's really interesting to see how some senators, some members, of our government have really come together and really focused on who matters, which is the American people.
Well, you talked there, Elizabeth, about the American people. Ed, you were talking about polls. Here's some polling from Public Policy Polling, which gives us an idea of the views and how Congress is being viewed over the last couple of weeks in the US. If you take a look at these, the first one people were asked was Congress approve or disapprove. Approve 8%, disapprove 86%. But it went on. What do you have a higher opinion of? Congress or cockroaches? As you can see there, cockroaches slightly edging it over Congress with 44 to 42%. 30%. Then it went on, what do you have a higher opinion of? Congress or hipsters? Congress there at 33%, hipsters at 42%. And slightly alarmingly, what do you have a higher opinion of? Congress or twerking? Many people probably pleased that twerking is just missing out there at 33%. But you're all smiling there, but there's just such a serious point here, and it's just, Ed, what can you say?
Well, look, I mean, first off, it's really easy to poll against twerking, cockroaches, and pretty much anything else. Hating Congress is something that everybody, it's sort of like a national pastime, because no matter what's going on, there's always a debate in Congress, and people are going to be angry over the debate, and so they dislike Congress. And then when you start polling on whether or not people like their current representative, support their current representative, usually the polls look significantly different than that. And so it's one of those temperature-taking things that maybe in a very long series has some meaning, but really honestly, that's more amusing than substantive at this point in time. That very clearly, nobody's very happy with what's going on in Washington, and you can tell by some of the other polling that was going on that everybody's numbers were going down in this standoff. President Obama's numbers were going down. The Republicans were going down. Republicans were going down more sharply, of course, but they were Democrats, President Obama, Republicans, that all their approvals were going down. This is not a situation in which anyone emerges a winner, because, like you said earlier, we do send people to Washington to have these great debates, but in the end, come up with an annual budget, do it on time, and ensure that the security of the American dollar is maintained. And for a variety of reasons, we've had a whole series of cliffs over the last several years, and that's really been a failure of the budgeting process, and that is a failure of Washington's core responsibility. And it's no wonder that people are very frustrated with it.
Well, Ed, you talk about you send people to Washington. I tweeted an article yesterday, which is quite interesting, talking about actually voters have to take some responsibility for this. Ultimately, Elizabeth, you're voting these people in. If they're not doing it properly, doesn't the system have to change? Don't you have to vote for better people?
Well, I definitely agree, but I think that we did vote a government. We did vote for people to make those decisions for us, and what's happening right now in Washington is brickmanship. It's people, on these standoffs, no one blinking, and it's ideological, wars. It's not really about the people. It's not really about us. And I think it's what we were saying before. A lot of people were disillusioned and are even more disillusioned now. And I think the goal of this faction, this radical function in the Republican Party is, that they're against government, and their aim was to show, that you don't really need government, when in reality, with the shutdown, it actually drawed a lot of attention to the things that we need, that the government does that are very important for us. Everything from national parks to, feeding our low-income seniors, or feeding, 9 million women and children who need it. So I think a lot of people are going to be realizing how important government is and don't want this to happen again.
And it's important to remember that many government workers were on unpaid leave for 16 days. We were hearing yesterday on World Service Radio, many people finding it difficult to pay their bills, to feed their children. Tiziana Deering has joined us, Associate Professor at Boston College. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I think the other guests have made a series of great points, so I won't repeat those, but I do think there are a couple of other things to keep in mind. The first is we have a series of structural problems here, too. Yes, we voted in this Congress and we voted in this president, but not everybody voted for the same people. And part of what we saw going on here was tremendous fidelity by especially representatives in the House to the people who voted for them. But when the nation doesn't agree, and when we're as polarized district by district and region by region as we are now, it's going to get really hard to make the tough decisions. And then we go back to that last comment. When that's the case, who falls between the cracks are the people who are falling between the cracks anyway. So our marginalized, our disenfranchised, our people living on the edge, we just blow them out of the water, and that's so wrong. It's just so backward.
When you talk about US voters being so polarized, Ed, is it really the Tea Party that's lost out with all of this, that they're going to lose many voters, many people being frustrated with their tactics?
Well, and I think that the previous guest, and I'm sorry I didn't recall her name, but the professor from Boston College makes a good point, is that basically what you have is you have representatives in Washington representing the constituents that sent them to Washington in the first place. Here's the problem with that type of fidelity is that things don't get done, which is what we're seeing right now. And that's not to say that people shouldn't remain, shouldn't have fidelity to their campaign promises, but at some point you still have to make the compromise. And I think that this is something that voters are going to have to take in mind, is that you do eventually have to allow people to reach a point where there's going to be compromise, and not try to burn the whole place down. Now, the Tea Party has some very good ideas about reducing government in certain areas. They are not nihilists, but this is part of the process. You have to. It's a process. You can't just elect a majority in one chamber of Congress and expect everything to change overnight. It takes time, and you have to build your case. You have to make the argument over a longer period of time until you convince more Americans that your position is correct. Same thing's true on the left.
So Americans need to be more patient, is essentially what you're saying, Ed. Well, let's cross now over to Nuala, who is live in the World's Newsroom. Nuala, who are you with right now?
Well, I have moved from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East. And with me is Rafid Jabouri from BBC Arabic. You're very welcome to the programme, Rafid. Can you tell us a little bit of what the reaction has been for the area you cover?
Well, if we speak about the banking sector and the financial institutions in the Middle East and North Africa, most of the statements and the sign that we had were from people who seemed to be assured that there was going to be a deal in the United States to save the situation and come off the brink. And that's what happened. So that's mainly, especially
that's one
from
view.
Yeah.
But what about the man on the street and woman on the street? Did they feel the same way?
Well, most of the people were actually, the reactions were more about the political ramifications and possible actually consequences of the financial difficulties in the United States. That's the American role on the international level, and especially in the Middle East issues like the situation in Syria. Talking specifically, our people actually are talking specifically, have been talking specifically about the cost of the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war. They believe that this had something to do, of course, with the financial difficulties that the United States is going through right now.
Isn't that interesting that, in fact, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, that's what's been seen in the Middle East as creating this government shutdown and this row over the debt ceiling, Chloe?
Well, lots more to come with this. Let's bring up this now, that the Boston Globe front page, this is from Thursday, yesterday, saying crisis over, well, for 3 months at least. One of the articles says that tired of the excruciating debate in Washington over the nation's budget, the debt ceiling and the deficit, well, get used to it. That's one thing we'll discuss in the next few minutes. Stay with us.
No, I am talking about it.
Let me say something.
No, I am talking about it.
Let me say something.
Welcome back. We're discussing the US debt deal and the impact it's had on US politics over the last, well, couple of weeks now. Let me introduce you to a new guest. Denny Springer is in Indiana and emailed the BBC. Brian Walsh has rejoined us, a Republican strategist in Washington, D.C. And Elizabeth Plank, editor at Policy Mike in New York, is still with us. Denny, are you one of these exasperated voters who've watched your politicians over the last couple of weeks in horror?
Yes, I'm one of those. There was lots of dysfunction that's been happening. I don't see any problem with us having disagreements within our country and within our politics, but the dysfunction that has happened really brought everything to a complete standstill. Aristotle told us a long time ago that the most perfect political community is one that is controlled by the middle class and, well, outnumbers both the other classes, the upper and lower classes, where the middle class is making those decisions. We've lost a lot of that in the United States. And I'm afraid that our gerrymandering and the way our election process has changed, it's not really ruled by the people anymore.
So what changes would you like to see?
Well, for one thing, gerrymandering needs to be outlawed or changed drastically. For the way it stands right now, my lawmaker chooses his district. He chooses his voters rather than the voters choosing the lawmaker. They draw the lines to be able to control who votes for which candidate so they can break up, say, the Republicans or the Democrats. And it goes both ways. technically, in my opinion, the voting gerrymandering should be done by judges and fair and impartial.
Brian, speak to Denny.
Well, I think he does. He raises a good point. I don't necessarily know that that's the right answer. I think inherently decisions should reside in the hands of the people, and if voters do not approve of the way their representative is acting, then they have the ability to fire them next year. But look, that doesn't exist in Senate races where you have a statewide election, and next year there's going to be a lot of critical Senate races. And you know, as a Republican, I'm glad this happened 13 months from the election and not 3 months before the election, because I do think Republicans have the opportunity to have some self-evaluation and hopefully right the ship.
Denny, you were trying to get in.
That's correct. The Senate is elected by the states. That's absolutely correct. That's two individuals. The congressional representatives that basically have, I think, brought a lot of this dysfunction. Well, I guess there's Mr. Cruz, but I think the Congress has brought a lot of this dysfunction along with the small faction that we have that we call the Tea Party. And that's been controlled by the districts that they can draw.
Sorry, Denny, slight delay there on the Skype line, but I want to just jump in because Nuala McGovern is back up live in the World's newsroom and she's grabbed someone else to speak to.
I do indeed, Chloe. I'm back in BBC Russian. Last week we spoke with Famil Ismailov. He's back here again. I hope you had a good week, Famil. Tell us the reaction this week to the US government shutdown and debt ceiling deal.
Well, the main thing for the Russians was the word default. They know what that means. They've been through it in 1998, and they get really jumpy when they hear anything about people losing their savings. So today, when the dollar is there, it's not losing its weight at all, and the government bonds of the United States are being to be paid. So the Russians are really relaxing and sighing with relief. There you go. There will be no default.
There will be no default. I'm just seeing one of the GMT clocks they have here. It's 19:50 in the evening in Moscow. So Friday evening, and a sigh of relief being felt in Russia.
We've got lots of comments coming into us. Donna in the US called to say the people who did the most damage were Obama and Kerry. They spoke about the US public in the same way the Chinese talk about us. Those two are trying to turn us into Europe. Is that so worrying, Donna? Frank posts on Facebook, how come you never talk about the mess and failure that Obamacare is? And Tony in New York has tweeted using the hashtag WHYS. Yes, we voted our politicians into office, but our choices are always the lesser of two evils. Well, that's all for this edition of World Have Your Say. If you want to carry on talking about this, you can go to facebook.com/World Have Your Say. But in just over an hour's time, you can join Nuala, who is going to be on BBC World Service Radio. They're going to be discussing what's been described by a politician here in the UK as national shame of England's high number of chronically lonely people. Well, thanks for your company this week. I will be back to speak with you again at the same time next week. Have a good week.